Welcome to the Safety Induction course from NR34, the regulatory standard that refers to the work conditions and environment in the shipbuilding and repair industry, and reinforced by the NR37, published at the end of 2018, specifically for the safety and health in oil platforms. At this course, we will learn about the risks of accidents inherent to the most of the activities we find aboard. We will also talk about the protective equipment available for us and the main conditions of our offshore work environment. Well, if you've ever been through a collective emergency, you know the importance of knowing your nearest escape route. So regardless of where you're taking this course, stop a second and think about it. If you don't know, I advise you to take a break and try to find out. And who presents this training for you? It is me, Tayane. I'm a safety professional with over 10 years of experience in the offshore industry. Today I work with an oil company that it is specialized in material fields, but I also have a wide experience with training in the area. Well, enough with presentations, right? The scope and applicability of the NR34 Safety Induction Training is designated to enhance the safety of workers and protect the environment. The completion of this course verifies that personnel have met basic regulatory and company-specific safety requirements to be able to work offshore. Although this training it is a requirement of the NR34, we also comment on other regulatory standards, such as the NR33 for confined space, NR11 for cargo handling, and so on. Here we can see the course content. We will see the risk inherent to the activity. This means all the activities that are usually held on board, the conditions and the work environment, like in the environment protection, and the protective equipment, like the collective and the emergency equipment available for us on board. And with that, the objective of this training is to qualify the student for tests on board the unit, provided by NR34 and related standards, granting familiarization knowledge about safe procedures at the offshore units. After completing all the activities in this course and reaching the statutory average for approval, you'll be able to have your certificate that will be valid for 1 year. I wish you an amazing training, and as you can see here on the page, you're also going to have available some additional readings and videos to add even more knowledge to your learning. And if for some reason you have difficulty with online studies, you can download all the content in PDF file. And we also have here a forum for students to interact with other students who are also taking this course, and also to interact with some trained professionals who will be available to answer any question. So let's start our content. This module will be divided in 3 parts. At the first part, we'll talk about regulatory standard, and we'll see some risk inherent to cargo handling activities. And at the second part, we'll see another risk inherent to the activities, like confined space, work at height, and at the third part, we'll analyze the most common occupational disease in the offshore industry. NR34, NR10, NR33, NR12. After all, what are NR? Let's understand a little bit about them. NR means Norma Regulamentadora, in English, Regulatory Standard. It came into force on 1978, changed the Chapter 5 of the CLT, that is the Consolidation of Work Laws here in Brazil. At the time that the NRs were created, several sectors in Brazil lacked legal guidance so that actions to improve work environment could be established. Before the NRs, the numbers of accidents and illness was very high. There are reports that in the 70s, for every 7 employees, 1 suffered an accident at work. We were living in an era of great economic growth. Many infrastructure construction, for example, were being carried out, causing with that several accidents and deaths due to the lack of safety. The pre-regulatory standard situation was very, very bad here in Brazil. According to the federal regulation, a regulatory standard is made up of labor obligations that must be fulfilled by every contractor. In other words, it is mandatory for all companies that have professional governed by the CLT, but also for you, the employee. This means that if you fail to comply with any of the items set out in the rules that governs your activity, you're subject to some penalties provided by law. With that said, each regulatory standard aims to prevent accidents and illness caused or aggravated by the service. But what can we define as a work accident here in Brazil? According to the Article 19, Accident at work is what occurs due to the exercise of work at the service of the company, causing injury or functional disorder that can cause the death or loss or reduction, permanent or temporary capacity for work. But it is worth mentioning that after the new labor reform that came into force in 2019, accidents on the way to work are no longer accidents at work. That is, if you are a Brazilian worker and you suffer an accident while going on board, it is no longer considered an accident at work. But this may not exempt the companies from the civil liability that will leave to a labor lawyer. So let's go to the main topic of this model, the risk inherent to the activities we have on board. Handling, it is one of the activities. We know that offshore operation with cranes, it is a fundamental activity and widely used, not only at oil platforms, but also at ships. As it is a high-risk operation, we know that there is no space for mistake. The specific regulatory standard for cargo handling in Brazil, it is the NR34ASI, which established that for each type of equipment, a specific training of 20 hours must be applied. In the case of cranes, each type of equipment must have a different approach, with a specific course, according to the scope given by NR34. After a basic training of cargo handling, also of 20 hours. There are a number of good practices to ensure safety during cargo handling. Therefore, workers should not fail to know the relevant types of offshore cranes and their construction, so really know how to differentiate the determined features of each crane, and thereby be able to select the right lift equipment for the job. Know the safety aspects and reasons for accidents related to the operation with offshore cranes. Know the general influence on operations when lifting and lowering with offshore cranes. Know the hook limit on the platform activities, and know how to access the mass of the load to be lifted. All this the operator learns as the cargo handling training, which it is mandatory to have a practical assessment. So there are some risks inherent to the offshore crane operations that should be highlighted as the movement of the vessels or swing. That is, the constant movement of the vessel makes it difficult to ensure that the crane is centered in relation to the load. This difference generates a pendulum movement that can cause violent collisions. There are several videos available on the internet that illustrate this phenomenon. The risk is even greater when transporting people. As we can see here on this video, one important information here is that the tagline is used to control the rotation and not the swing. Another critical risk is the chance that the steel cable may break. It can be caused by the dynamic loading, by shear, due to the axial force combined with the perpendicular compression of the cable. Or maybe due to the expiration of the service life and also the poor operation of the crane. Weather conditions. Here there are factors such as wind direction, waves, sea current, and reduced operator visibility, maybe due to the sunlight or that the sun it is on his eyes, for example. These factors are added to the already mentioned load displacement in relation to the crane and increase the swing effect. According to NR34, the cargo handling operation must be stopped in adverse weather conditions and must be stopped as well in poor lighting. We know that the wind can cause a lateral force and force the crane boom to exceed the safe working limits, so we should learn the maximum wind speed to operate safely, and we must stop lifting operations if the wind poses any danger. And the dynamic efforts. The difference between the relative speed of the lifting hook and the load on the deck can cause an abrupt tension in the cable, which leads to a much greater effort and increasing the momentum resulting from the boom, and consequently with that, in the rotation base. To get around this problem, the cranes have that reinforcements of the cables and the base. So these dynamic efforts are the efforts like the wind, like bumps that the load undergoes, and especially the effort against gravity. The higher the lifting speed, the greater the effort required. That is why the effective sling capacity must always be respected. And as for every task, planning is a critical point. The barriers must be in place to prevent personnel from being near or underneath the suspended load. The communication method must be available and must be tested. We should verify that simultaneous operations are compatible, if lifting devices are suitable and are being used according to the manufacturer's instruction for use, and if the landing area can accommodate the cargo in terms of size and weight. All facilities must have dedicated areas where lifting equipment that it is not in use must be stored. We must be careful with this equipment and not leave it exposed to the sun and other harmful environment conditions. And to ensure control, an updated record must be kept of the lifting equipment. Pre-inspection is a fundamental step for an activity, mainly those of cargo handling and working at height. The user must inspect the equipment before and after use, and the user is also responsible for returning the lift equipment to the storage area after use. It is important that damaged equipment must be marked and reserved in a designated place, clearly identified for this purpose. The reason for this, I believe, is very clear. Yeah? Many companies nowadays use the color code. That's basically the identification, normally by painting, carried out with the purpose of visually identifying that the equipment or the accessory of cargo handling has passed inspection and has been approved for use. In the company that I work today, we consider, for example, black for equipment and materials to be disposed of. And for all the defective cargo handling equipment and accessories with an expiration certificate or without certification, we must paint in red color and remove them from the use until they are inspected and approved for use by a specialized company. We have the risk of manual handling of loads that cover a variety of activities that may affect the health of our offshore employees. As the presentation says, the spine, due to its disc structure, is not very resistant to force contrary to its axis, as can be seen in the figure here. When the load is lifted in the most upright position, the compression effort is evenly distributed over the entire surface of the vertebra and discs. So in this position, most upright, it is possible to reduce the compression on the disc by about 20% compared to lifting in the curved position. So how should we transport loads? Just like a kid of 1 to 3 years old. If you have a son or a nephew or a niece at home at this age, notice that the kid squats with its back straight and carries the load keeping the back in line. Why do we lose this posture? And whenever possible, we should use transport equipment preferable with wheels, avoid carrying weight with one hand, use body movement in favor of movement, analyze the path, and always try to pass through hard and level floor. According to data from NIOSH, the US federal agency responsible for conducting research and producing recommendations for the prevention of work-related injuries and illness, says that lifting weight should be limited to a maximum of 20 kilos for repetitive lifting in certain circumstances. The posture and movement should be alternated, and whenever possible, you should work as a team, and the load should be lowered gently on the floor. And we have finished the first part of this initial model. See you at the second part.